Welcome, viewers. In today's edition of the Geo Interview, we have with us Mr. William Klein, who's currently a consulting partner with FGS Global, a global strategic communications company. Sir has also been a member of the U.S. State Department's Senior Foreign Service. Mr. William Klein has dedicated the majority of his diplomatic career to leadership roles at the heart of the U.S. China relationship. Welcome, Mr. Klein. How are you?
Well, thank you very much. I'm very well and very, very excited to talk to you today.
Yes, sir. So given your long experience in diplomacy, I would like to ask you this question, that how does it help you in your latest stint in the corporate world? And what sort of role do you see for the companies playing in helping and solving the ongoing geopolitical fissures?
Well, first of all, the most important job that any diplomat anywhere in the world has is to understand the country in which she or he works. Our job is then to understand the host country's perceptions towards our government and towards our country, to understand that country's interests, to understand perceptions of the host country, of the government, and of the society towards our country, and also towards the policies that we as a country pursue. So that means that diplomats have to be very, very empathetic. And all of these skills are very, very important in the corporate world as well, particularly nowadays, where we are seeing that the role of politics in economics is increasing and is greater than perhaps any time in the past generation. We are seeing that multiple stakeholders, whether that is governments, investors, the media, civil society, consumers, clients, etc., suppliers, all of these stakeholders are also scrutinizing corporate behavior more than any before than most any of us can remember. And there too, then business executives also have to be empathetic to understand the perspectives of these stakeholders and to manage all of that. So a diplomatic career is extremely useful for the corporate world, particularly in today's corporate world, where, as I said, governments are prioritizing, in many respects, their national security or their economic security over the commercial interests of many of their companies.
Truly, sir, we live in a globalized world. So with the world increasingly coming to terms with Chinese aggression and the aims that the Chinese president have himself conveyed, that what they aim to achieve, how much do you think that China will be able to maintain its economy and increase its hard power, given that several groupings like be it Quad or AUKUS are increasingly propping up?
Well, first of all, China is the second largest economy in the world, according to pure GDP figures. China has, as it continues to modernize, is also becoming an important source of innovation in the global economy. China also needs a stable and predictable economic, regulatory, and also geopolitical environment in order to pursue its domestic ambitions. And at the same time, China, of course, has its geopolitical ambitions. And in many ways, these geopolitical ambitions do not contradict the geopolitical interests and ambitions of other great powers in the country, in the world, be that the United States or, for example, India. At the same time, the tensions and the distrust and the sources thereof are readily known to all of us. So I don't think I need to reiterate any of that. So managing this strategic distrust among great powers, managing this rivalry among great powers will be very, very important for leaders in all of these countries moving forward. The United States and China's relationship is indeed characterized by strategic competition and by deep strategic distrust. At the same time, neither the United States nor China has an interest in allowing this distrust and this competition to descend into confrontation or conflict. That is something that neither side wishes. And for that reason, we are seeing an effort on both sides to manage this distrust, to contain this competition. We are seeing a similar movement on behalf of India and China. There too, the deep strategic distrust and competition at the heart of the relationship is framing diplomatic engagement between the two countries more and more. I mean, we have followed, with tremendous concern all of the border disputes in recent years. There too, we observe that India and China have an interest in containing the competition and the distrust and these types of disputes, even though solving these disputes may be very, very difficult from a contemporary perspective. But very, very clearly, all sides have an interest in containing competition, containing distrust. And it's also true for all of the other major players in the world, whether that is the European Union, whether that is the ASEAN countries of Asia, whether that is the various types of arrangements that we are seeing, both in the economic realm or in the security realm emerging, is that countries are very, very acutely aware of the geopolitical headwinds, but have an interest in managing that. Whether this is going to work or not, and whether we will be successful, really depends on the leadership and the wisdom of officials around the world and how they manage their own domestic constituencies. I, for one, am optimistic that the world will manage this geopolitical competition.
So given that you mentioned that there exists a deep strategic mistrust between US and China, and given your long diplomatic career in dealing with China, what sort of additional policy solutions would you suggest to both the parties?
I think first and foremost, it is very, very important that the two sides talk to each other, that the two sides communicate to each other. Only by, and I know this as a diplomat, only by face-to-face communication is it possible, first of all, to truly understand the other side's perspectives. Also to understand the priority of the other side's interests and concerns. And then over time, through this type of communication, to understand where the other side may be flexible, where the other side is not flexible at all. And so what is then at all possible? This type of communication doesn't always lead to results, but if you don't have this type of communication, you cannot have these types of results. So that's, I think, the most important thing. And we have seen that the United States and China recognize this. President Biden and Chinese leader Xi Jinping met, as we all know, on the margins of the G20 in Indonesia late last year. The American government has announced that Secretary of State Tony Blinken will be visiting China in early February. We know that the climate envoys of the two countries also had a conversation recently. So these types of conversations are incredibly important. Beyond that, what is necessary is that these conversations just don't stay at that level, but rather that they shape then how the two sides then engage with each other. And in particular, how the two sides identify those issues that are driving distrust, and think about ways then to collectively manage that distrust. For example, in the military realm, the United States is a resident Pacific power. It has been since 1945, and the United States is not going anywhere. China's military capabilities are growing, and as that takes place, China is projecting its naval and air power deeper into the Pacific, so that the contact between the two navies and the likelihood of encounters is only increasing. And for that reason, it is very, very important that the two militaries have understandings, have lines of communication open, have patterns of behavior and notification, etc., to ensure that encounters and the intentions of encounters are understood correctly and do not lead to miscalculations, to mistakes that then could evolve into a broader source of confrontation. So for that reason, Prajash, the two sides beyond the high-level communication have to establish some sort of, I wouldn't call them confidence-building measures necessarily, but rather conflict mitigation and conflict avoiding measures to ensure that these sources of distrust don't snowball and get out of hand. Those are just a couple of examples. There's many, many more.
So that was indeed very in-depth and insightful, but I truly agree that communication should be a part of U.S. China relationship. So now from geopolitics, I would like to draw your attention towards geoeconomics. So given that there is so much power polarity in our world right now, how do you see the future of globalization as we go ahead? And I say this because regionalization of trade is something that is increasingly coming up front. So as a diplomat, how do you perceive these regional economic groupings?
Well, first of all, there's a lot of talk about the future of globalization, and I would agree with the assessment that we are perhaps beyond peak globalization. I would define that peak globalization as economic relationships that are first and foremost driven by comparative advantage, right? That goods, services, capital, ideas flow according to relative price differences between economies. That continues to drive most global commerce and global investment, and it will continue to drive commerce and investment in the future. Having said that, as we mentioned earlier, governments are now prioritizing economic and national security more than over the commercial interests of their companies in many ways. And we are seeing that they are taking measures that are increasing the costs and shifting the comparative advantage. A great example of this were the Trump administration's tariffs on Chinese imports and China's reciprocal actions, or the measures that the United States has now undertaken to stem the flow of semiconductors and related technologies to China from the United States. And I think in the key technologies that drive innovation and prosperity in the 21st century, you will see governments continuing to take measures like this, prioritizing economic and national security. You mentioned economic or regional economic groupings. What we are seeing is that the World Trade Organization's or efforts to reform the World Trade Organization are increasingly difficult for many reasons. First of all, because of the multitude of interests among the members and trying to find consensus, and then secondly, domestic political trends in individual countries. For that reason, we have seen the growth of regional types of economic arrangements. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, I think, was the best example. That was envisioned as a high standard agreement that goes way beyond the requirements of the World Trade Organization, addresses many of the perceived shortcomings of the World Trade Organization, and creates a group of like-minded trading partners that adhere to high standards, and that it was the hope that would then shape the trading and investment environment in the Indo-Pacific region in the future. As we know, because of domestic political concerns, the United States walked away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership on Donald Trump's first day in office. And even before that, there was not a political majority for ratification of the TPP. And since then, there is still no majority in the United States for this type of trade arrangement. For that reason, we're seeing different types of arrangements. For example, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is the latest attempt to address many of these issues while circumventing the issue of and the touchy, politically sensitive issue of trade liberalization. We see that China, the RCEP is up and running as well. And I think that moving forward, if you do see trade liberalization, it will be in sub-regional arrangements, and or it will be in arrangements that perhaps avoid the thorny issues of pure trade liberalization per se, and address other barriers to trade, and facilitate other types of economic cooperation.
So given your in-depth answer on globalization and your experience as a US diplomat, I'm compelled to ask you this question on the US Inflation Reduction Act. How do you perceive it from the context of globalization and the relationship between US and EU?
As I mentioned, governments are prioritizing national economic security. And in doing so, they are adopting industrial policy measures that just a few years ago, I think most of us would have thought are unthinkable or politically untenable. But because of geopolitical rivalries and competition in the world, industrial policy is back. And I think that looking forward, industrial policy is here to stay, at least for as far as our expectation horizons can extend into the future. And the Inflation Reduction Act is an example of U.S. industrial policy that reflects this view. It pursues many goals, but one of them is also then to make the United States particularly competitive in some of the technologies that will drive growth and innovation and prosperity in this century. It was done with U.S. interest first and foremost in mind. It was done from a U.S. domestic perspective, keeping U.S. domestic political considerations in mind. We've seen with the reaction here in Europe that either the United States did not fully take into account European concerns about this law, or it took them into account, but then in the cost-benefit analysis deemed it still in the U.S. interest to move forward as it is now specified in the law. I can say that here in Europe, the concern about these particularly local content requirements of the IRA are of tremendous concern here in Europe, and no shortage of European leaders have articulated both publicly and also in direct conversations with U.S. government officials their concerns about this law. The Biden administration has acknowledged these concerns, has said that it wants to accommodate European concerns. How exactly the Biden administration plans to do that, I wouldn't dare predict. I think we'll have to wait and see. And then the second big, question about the IRA is that, what, if anything, are the Europeans going to do in response? We've already seen that this week the European Union announced a package of measures. And but very clear the European Union and the United States, all of their differences over the IRA notwithstanding, do not have an interest in allowing these differences then to devolve into a industrial policy conflict and subsidy war between each other. I think that is very, very clear on both sides. So at the moment, you're seeing a lot of damage control, if I can call it that, and I think sincere efforts on both sides to find an accommodation. But like I said, what that accommodation might look like, whether it's even possible, whether it will truly satisfy European concerns while at the same time satisfying the interests of American stakeholders remains to be seen.
So coming from the western part of the world, now I would like to shift your focus onto Indo-Pacific. And so given that China is hell-bent on building its infrastructure along its borders with India, how much do you think China will be comfortable living beside an India that is economically growing very fast and that and whose geopolitical clout is increasing?
Well, I think that China understands that India's influence is increasing and that India's comprehensive national power also will only increase in the coming years and decades, and that China has to then live with a more powerful and assertive India. Just like India has to live with a powerful and assertive China. That is normal among great powers. And the question is how these two sides then manage this relationship. Again, we talked a little bit earlier about the distrust and the competition driving this relationship. And I think it's safe to say that that is not going away. However, both sides have an interest in containing that, and I am confident that you will see continued effort on both sides. But specifically, China looking at India will indeed attempt to contain these differences and to prevent them from descending into conflict. At the same time, we can expect that China will continue to very assertively advance its interests on issues of such as the border disputes. These are very, very difficult issues to address, very, very difficult issues to ever solve. And that too, I think, will be an issue that will continue to attract all of our attention in the Indo-Pacific moving forward. But I am very confident that the leadership on both sides will continue to prioritize finding accommodations so that this competition doesn't worsen to a level of conflict.
So we've talked about geopolitics, and till now we've also talked about geoeconomics. Now, if there is one thing that sits at the confluence of both these theaters, it is technology. So how much do you think that the United States will be able to limit its technological dominance or superiority and know-how from being appropriated by China?
So the United States has already been very, very explicit, the Biden administration, that it not only has a defensive posture with respect to certain types of high technology. Let's just take semiconductors as an example. It also wants to maintain an absolute competitive advantage in these cutting-edge semiconductors over China. How successful will the United States be? I think that remains to be seen. I do think, however, that because of the strategic advantages that the United States has already developed in some of these high-tech industries in recent decades, give it a very, very strong position in order to maintain this competitive advantage over China. What we are seeing in the semiconductor area, I think, is the most notable example of decoupling, if we want to call it that. And I think that this type of decoupling is absolutely here to stay. in the semiconductor realm for higher value-added semiconductor, not in the generic semiconductors. I think you're going to see this in other areas as well, whether it is quantum computing, artificial intelligence, whether it is biotechnology, just to name several examples. There too, you're going to see both sides trying to create a strategic advantage and prevent the other side from gaining, from catching up, as it were. How effective will this be? How will third countries position themselves in this? It remains to be seen. I think the idea that you can build high fences around these types of technologies, it will be absolutely possible to a certain extent, but these high fences will be porous for any number of reasons, so that you will continue to see a certain amount of intellectual and technological dissemination, but it will be far more costly and it'll be far slower between the blocks. But that's in the high-tech areas. I think there's most global commerce is completely banal, I would say, if I can characterize it that way, from a national security point of view. And their division of labor, comparative advantage, will continue to shape trade and economic flows.
So thank you so much, sir. This is going to be one of my last questions. Given a lot of developments have been happening in the Indo-Pacific, be it Japan's increasing or doubling its defense expenditure, or Europe's long pivot to Indo-Pacific in terms of strategic partnerships, whether be it India or other South Asian countries, do you think containment is a possibility that China fears? Or is it more like China thinks that now it's too hard for the West or for the world to contain?
Well, I know from experience, working at the heart of the U.S. China relationship, that the Chinese leadership, and frankly, many people in China, if not a majority, do believe that the United States has the strategic intention to contain China. If not to contain China, then at least to disrupt its modernization aspirations. I know for a fact that those are not the U.S. Intentions, but because of the distrust that exists between the two sides, it's not easy to persuade Chinese partners and interlocutors from that. So I think China views U.S. intentions through that perspective, also views U.S. Strategic, military, diplomatic, and economic intentions in the Indo-Pacific region through that prism as well. And what China is trying to do, as we see, is to ensure that it maintains freedom of movement, freedom of agency across the Indo-Pacific space. In particular, it wants to ensure that other countries do not make common cause with the United States. It fully recognizes that many countries in the region have deep shared interests with the United States. At the same time, it wants to ensure that those deep shared interests do not evolve into a common anti-Chinese bloc, as it were. This type of rivalry will continue to shape diplomacy and geopolitical trends in the Indo-Pacific moving forward. I think, but because the United States' intention is not to contain China, I am confident that this type of geopolitical positioning, this type of geopolitical rivalry, as it were, ultimately, despite whatever tensions and headlines it may create in individual cases, will not fundamentally undermine stability and prosperity in the region.
Sir, as a US diplomat working at the highest levels, what has been your experience in the job? And what sort of advices would you have for us, the young people who are interested in geopolitics or foreign policies?
Well, first of all, diplomatic life, diplomatic career is an amazing privilege, and people whose personal situations then allow them to move around the country, around the world. I'm sorry, every 3 or 4 years. It's a tremendous opportunity, and I highly urge young people interested in global politics to take a good hard look at diplomacy and the ability and the opportunities to represent their country. Beyond that, we are seeing that geopolitics shaping so much more of our lives today as the world becomes more interconnected, as globalization marches forward. That the role of geopolitics in economic life, in political life, in social life in our countries is only going to grow. So, and also the need to understand geopolitics is very important, regardless of what type of career path one pursues, whether it's in business, whether it's in technology, academia, in government, etc. And for that reason, it's time very well spent to just invest in understanding the fundamentals of geopolitics today, and in particular how geopolitics shape the environment for whatever field you are interested in.
So, given our discussion before we started the interview, and as you told us that you've also worked in India. So, what has been your experience working in India?
Very, very positive. Our job as diplomats is to engage people from the host country and the host society, and that was very easy in India. People across Indian society were very gracious with their time, were very hospitable. I can't recall how many invitations I received from Indians across all groups of society, personal invitations to come to their homes, to get to meet their families, to have meals with them. And so that was my most memorable and cherished experience. Obviously, really won over my heart in India. So it was a tremendous experience personally, also professionally. I saw working in India that the United States and India are actually natural partners. I think we in the United States sometimes got a little bit overexcited about just how much Indian and U.S. interests overlap, because and I learned that in India is that India has its own perspective on many things, including how India looks at the United States and U.S. interests. But still, that was very, very satisfactory to have very in-depth and very productive and constructive, respectful conversations with members of the Indian government, Indian political parties, civil society, the media, academia, about U.S.-Indian relations and how the two sides can deepen those relations. And if I look back, I think we've been very successful. That comprehensive ties between the United States and China have only gotten stronger in recent years.
Well, Mr. Klein, that was an amazing interview, or I would say an amazing discussion on U.S., China, and the Indo-Pacific. We sincerely thank you for joining us, and we hope to host you someday soon.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I look forward to continuing our conversation in the future.
Yes, thank you so much, sir.
Okay.